Frost rimed the barbed wire like cruel lace, each strand glittering under the dim light of a winter moon. The wind carried with it a low whistle, thin and sharp, the kind that made skin prickle as though the air itself bore knives. Within the wooden barracks, Japanese women huddled together, their breaths fogging in the cold, their thin blankets no match for December's unrelenting bite. Silence reigned, broken only by the occasional cough, a muffled sob, or the hollow creak of the timber walls. They had prepared themselves for hunger, humiliation, and the bitter taste of defeat. What they had not prepared for was the smell that crept in through the cracks, an aroma so rich and unfamiliar that it seemed to mock their suffering. It was soup. Hot, savory, the scent layered with onions, potatoes, and something far more decadent than wartime survival usually permitted. The women exchanged uneasy glances. Some clenched their fists, suspecting trickery, while others inhaled greedily, ashamed of the involuntary hunger written across their faces. In their minds, Americans were ogres, giants of a brutal, alien land, raised on myths of cruelty. Propaganda had taught them that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that enemy hands would strip away their humanity like skin from bone. Yet here, in this cold corner of a camp far from their island home, the enemy was stirring pots. The sound of boots on frozen gravel announced their approach. American guards, shoulders squared in thick coats, carried metal buckets that steamed like miniature volcanoes. Their faces were wind-burned, their breath curling white into the night. One soldier, freckles bright against his pale skin, chuckled as he adjusted his grip. Another, taller, muttered about the cold, stamping his feet as though to keep blood from freezing. They did not look like monsters. They looked, to the women's startled eyes, almost boyish, weary but steady, men who might have been brothers had the world not been split by banners and empires. Tin cups rattled as the soldiers entered the barracks. A ladle plunged into the broth, rising again with chunks of carrot and potato, steam swirling upward like a genie loosed from a lamp. The first woman to step forward hesitated, clutching her coat tighter. Her name was Keiko, a schoolteacher once, before the war had torn her from classrooms and thrust her into chaos. She bowed, stiff and trembling, unsure whether this act of submission would be scorned or met with kindness. The soldier holding the ladle gave her a nod, nothing dramatic, nothing ceremonial. Just a nod, as though to say, "You're human, you're hungry, here is food." When the soup touched her lips, Keiko closed her eyes. It was thick, earthy, unfamiliar yet life-giving. She had braced herself for cruelty disguised as mercy, perhaps poisoned slop or scraps meant to humiliate. Instead, it was warmth that spread down her throat, seeping into her bones like a promise she did not trust but could not deny. Tears stung her eyes, though whether from gratitude or shame she could not tell. Behind her, the other women shuffled forward, one by one, their faces half-starved masks slowly cracking open to astonishment. Then came the second surprise: pie. The Americans had brought not only soup but wedges of apple pie, their crusts golden, their filling glossy under the dim bulbs that flickered overhead. To the Japanese women, it was absurd, surreal, a dessert out of a foreign dream. Apple pie had been whispered about, written into propaganda leaflets as proof of decadent enemy excess, but here it was, tangible, crumbling beneath trembling fingers. One woman laughed, a sound sharp and nervous, almost hysterical. Another murmured under her breath, "This cannot be real." Yet it was real. They chewed slowly, eyes wide, the sweetness exploding against tongues accustomed to bitterness. The pie was not merely food, it was contradiction on a plate, a challenge to everything they had been told to believe. If the enemy could offer sweetness, what else had been a lie? The room, once heavy with despair, now held a charged, fragile quiet, the silence of people whose entire worldview had begun to fracture with each bite. The guards, for their part, did not linger to bask in their astonishment. They moved with mechanical rhythm, filling cups, sliding pie onto plates, then retreating with the same steady discipline with which they had arrived. But one, a young soldier with tired blue eyes, paused at the doorway. He glanced back, saw the women hunched over their food, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. To him, perhaps, it was no more than a duty fulfilled on a frigid night. To them, it was an event so strange it bordered on the miraculous. Keiko set her empty tin aside, her hands still trembling. Her stomach was warm, but her mind felt colder than ever. What did this mean? Were these acts of mercy genuine, or were they meant to soften resolve, to make captives pliable? She thought of her family back in Japan, of the codes of honor drilled into her since childhood. She had been told the enemy would strip her of dignity. Instead, they had given her dignity she no longer knew how to carry. Around her, the women whispered, their voices quivering like candle flames. Some wept silently, clutching their pie crusts as though afraid they would vanish. Others sat motionless, refusing to betray emotion, though their eyes betrayed storms of confusion. The enemy had served them not death, not ridicule, but food, simple, human food that could thaw even the hardest night. The paradox was unbearable. Outside, the wind keened across the camp, rattling barbed wire against wooden posts. The moon slipped behind clouds, darkening the frozen earth. Inside, however, there was warmth, fragile and flickering, carried not by fire or blankets, but by bowls of soup and slices of pie. It was a night no one had expected, a night that hinted, dangerously, that humanity had survived the war's machinery of hate. Yet for Keiko and the others, this was only the beginning. They did not yet know that the greatest battles ahead would not be fought with rifles or bombs, but with memory, shame, and the quiet power of kindness that demanded to be reckoned with. For if apple pie could cross the barbed wire, what else might follow? The morning after the soup and pie, the barracks awoke to a strange quiet. The frost still clung to the wire, the wind still gnawed at the wooden walls, but something invisible had shifted. The women stirred from their bunks not with the leaden dread of prisoners awaiting humiliation, but with the reluctant curiosity of those who had glimpsed a reality they could not yet explain. Keiko moved carefully, her body stiff from cold, her mind restless from memory. She could still taste the apple, sweet and tart, a flavor that seemed to linger longer than it should, as though refusing to leave her mouth, or her thoughts. By mid-morning, the Americans appeared again, carrying trays instead of buckets this time. The routine was clinical, almost rehearsed, yet the effect was anything but ordinary. The trays bore bread, thick slices, pale and steaming, and small pats of butter that softened slowly in the warmth. Alongside it came bowls of oatmeal, sprinkled with a dusting of sugar. Sugar. The glistening crystals caught the light like jewels, absurd luxuries in a world of shortages and ration books. The women exchanged bewildered looks. Some refused at first, shaking their heads stiffly, unwilling to betray weakness. Others accepted cautiously, suspicion shadowing their hunger. But once the butter melted, once the sugar dissolved on their tongues, resistance gave way to silent astonishment. For women who had braced themselves for starvation, the abundance was an insult to expectation. In Japanese camps, Allied prisoners had wasted away on little more than rice gruel, their bodies reduced to shadows. Here, the tables had turned. The women, once taught to despise and fear the enemy, now found themselves treated better than their own countrymen had treated prisoners of war. The irony was too sharp to swallow cleanly. They chewed and swallowed anyway, guilt pressing down like another weight upon their shoulders. Keiko found herself watching the guards closely, searching for cracks in the facade. The young soldier with freckles, the one who had ladled her soup the night before, whistled under his breath as he stacked trays. It was an unremarkable tune, some American melody she could not place, but its casualness unsettled her. How could he hum as though the world were ordinary? Did he not know that their lives had been shattered, their homes burned, their futures stolen? And yet the tune carried on, light and careless, refusing to acknowledge her anguish. At night, in whispers, the women argued among themselves. Some said it was deception, a trick meant to weaken their spirit, to lure them into compliance. Others insisted it was mockery, a performance staged to flaunt the enemy's wealth. But still others, those who had let their guards drop for the briefest moment, wondered if perhaps it was neither. Perhaps, against all reason, it was genuine. That thought was the most terrifying of all. The statistics of war, cold and impartial, hung over them like ghosts. They knew from scattered rumors that Allied prisoners under Japanese command had perished by the thousands, their survival rates abysmal, their suffering infamous. Here, however, the opposite appeared to be true. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention and a culture that saw honor not in cruelty but in order, seemed determined to maintain a standard of treatment that felt alien to women raised under the banner of Bushido. In Japan, surrender was synonymous with disgrace. In this camp, surrender had been met not with execution, but with porridge and pie. Still, the kindness did not erase the humiliation. Keiko often sat by the barracks window, staring out at the wire, wondering what her family would think if they could see her now. Would they condemn her for accepting bread from the enemy? Would they call her weak, dishonorable? She bit her lip until it bled, ashamed of the small comfort she found in a full stomach. Yet hunger was a tyrant that silenced even the most stubborn ideals. One evening, as the guards distributed rations, a soldier attempted a phrase in Japanese. His accent was atrocious, the syllables mangled beyond recognition, but the effort was unmistakable. For a moment, the barracks filled with startled laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, but human, uncontrollable, born of shock. The guard flushed red, shrugged, and handed over a slice of pie as if to say, "Language may fail us, but pie will not." The women laughed again, and though the sound was strange in their ears, it softened the hard edges of the night. Keiko, listening to the laughter, felt something tighten in her chest. It was not relief, not joy, but something far more complicated. She realized with a jolt that she no longer knew which world was true. The one she had been raised to believe in, where enemies were demons, or the one that now unfolded before her eyes, where demons handed out dessert. The contradiction gnawed at her more fiercely than hunger ever had. In time, routine settled like snow on rooftops. Soup and bread, porridge and pie, cocoa on especially bitter nights. The extraordinary became ordinary, which was perhaps the strangest turn of all. The women adapted, though never fully. They ate with gratitude and guilt, with suspicion and relief, their hearts caught in a tug-of-war between indoctrination and lived experience. Each meal was a reminder that the world was upside down, that nothing, least of all the enemy, was as it seemed. Outside the wire, the war still raged, battles burning across islands and seas. Inside, in this frozen pocket of captivity, another battle unfolded, quieter but no less brutal, the war within themselves. And as Keiko lay awake one night, her belly warm but her heart unsettled, she understood that the true conflict was no longer about survival of the body. It was about survival of belief. And belief, unlike hunger, could not be satisfied with soup. Winter dragged on like a cruel teacher, each day a lesson in endurance, each night a test of memory. The Japanese women endured the routine of captivity with a strange mixture of resignation and disbelief. The soup, the bread, the occasional pie, all these had become part of their lives now, yet their hearts refused to settle. It was not the cold that gnawed most deeply, nor the barbed wire, but the unraveling inside, the slow disintegration of certainties they had once held unshakable. Keiko, once a teacher whose voice had commanded quiet respect, now spoke in hushed tones, as though every word risked betrayal. She found herself caught between two selves, the woman who had bowed before her students with pride in the emperor, and the woman who now bowed to receive bread from enemy hands. At night, she replayed the faces of her students, wondering if they would despise her for living while others perished. Yet when she closed her eyes, what lingered was not their judgment but the strange comfort of soup steaming in her palms. Survival had its own morality, one she could neither embrace nor reject. The barracks themselves had become a stage for contradictions. In one corner, women whispered prayers to ancestors, begging forgiveness for their shame. In another, they giggled softly over the clumsy attempts of guards to speak Japanese, their laughter rising like birds startled into flight. Hunger had turned into fullness, fear into awkward familiarity, and yet the shame remained, a shadow trailing every act of acceptance. There were small exchanges that left indelible marks. A soldier once placed an extra spoonful of potatoes in Keiko's bowl, offering a faint smile that spoke of nothing more than human decency. She froze, unsure whether to thank him or scorn the gesture. In the end, she accepted silently, the warmth of the food at odds with the chill of guilt in her chest. Another time, a young mother among the prisoners, Emiko, was given a small bar of chocolate. She broke it into pieces so tiny they dissolved before they could be properly tasted, passing them to the women around her. Some wept at the sweetness, more painful than hunger itself. The camp was not paradise. It was fenced with wire, patrolled with rifles, and filled with the ache of homesickness, but it was also not the nightmare they had braced themselves for. This was the heart of the unraveling, the realization that the enemy was not a monster but a man. And once that door opened, it could not be shut again. Keiko noticed how the guards sometimes lingered, leaning on rifles as if weary of their own roles. They were young, most of them scarcely older than her students had been. One, with sandy hair and a crooked grin, once offered a tentative wave to a group of women gathered by the laundry line. They stiffened, unsure whether to return it. Emiko, bold in her own quiet way, raised her hand back. The soldier laughed, a sound startling in its warmth, and walked on. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispers about the wave, some condemning, others secretly comforted. Music, too, seeped through the camp like contraband hope. On rare evenings, soldiers gathered near their quarters, harmonicas and guitars filling the air with foreign melodies. The women listened in silence, pressed against the walls of their barracks, hearts tugged in directions they could not name. The songs were strange, but the laughter between notes was universal. For a moment, barbed wire seemed less like a cage and more like a veil, thin, transparent, almost ignorable. Yet with each gesture of kindness, the conflict inside deepened. These women had been taught that loyalty meant death, that to surrender was to erase oneself. Now they faced the unbearable truth that their captors had not erased them, but recognized them. Humanity had been returned where they had expected only scorn. And with that recognition came a terrible weight. The knowledge that the world was not as simple as they had believed, that perhaps their enemies were not demons, and by extension, that perhaps their own empire's truths were not unassailable. Keiko felt this fracture most keenly one evening as she held a cup of cocoa. The warmth seeped into her fingers, and for a moment she allowed herself to close her eyes, to imagine she was safe at home. But the fantasy was broken by a single thought. The cocoa was American. She could not drink without tasting betrayal. She lifted the cup anyway, sipping slowly, each swallow both comfort and wound. The unraveling was not loud. It was quiet, insidious. It spread in glances, in shared laughter, in the memory of sweetness. It lived in the way Emiko hummed along to a soldier's guitar without realizing it, or how another woman began to mimic English words shyly when she thought no one noticed. It grew in the way Keiko's stomach no longer clenched with fear at the sight of guards, but with a reluctant anticipation of supper. Survival had changed them in ways no one dared speak aloud, but everyone felt. Outside the barracks, war still demanded blood and fire. Inside, another war raged, one that left no corpses but carved deep scars in the spirit. The unraveling of belief, of certainty, of the line between us and them, was perhaps more dangerous than any weapon. For once a truth is undone, it cannot easily be remade. On a night when snow fell heavy and muffled the world, Keiko lay awake listening to the slow breathing of those around her. She thought of the students she had once taught, the emperor she had once revered, the family she had once obeyed. And she thought, too, of the soup, the bread, the pie, the cocoa. Two worlds warred within her chest, neither yielding. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, for she understood something now with painful clarity. The enemy was changing her, reshaping her from within, and she could not stop it. And what awaited on the other side of that change, she dared not yet imagine. Snow had begun to thaw when the final act of their captivity revealed itself, not in violence or cruelty, but in a feast. By then, the Japanese women had grown accustomed to the rhythm of soup and bread, to the quiet contradictions that gnawed at their hearts. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what the Americans prepared on that night, as if determined to prove that the war was not only fought on battlefields, but also at tables. It began with the smell, rich and heavy, drifting long before the food appeared. The women lined up cautiously, the barracks buzzing with an unease that bordered on dread. Then came platters of roasted turkey, carved thick and steaming, glistening under lantern light. Bowls of mashed potatoes followed, buttery and whipped to clouds, alongside corn glistening gold, biscuit stacked high, and pies, pumpkin, cherry, and the ever-present apple. It was excess beyond imagining, the kind of meal even some Americans had not seen since the Depression, yet here it was, laid before prisoners of war. Keiko stared at her plate, her hands trembling. This was not rations, not survival. This was abundance, deliberate and undeniable. She thought of her homeland, where families scoured fields for scraps, where rice itself had become scarce, where hunger stalked like an unrelenting ghost. And here, the enemy offered her more than she could possibly finish. Her mind screamed of trickery, of shame, of the dishonor of acceptance. But her stomach, treacherous and human, begged otherwise. She lifted her fork and tasted the turkey, tender and smoky. Tears welled before she could stop them. Around her, the women sat in stunned silence, the clatter of utensils the only sound breaking the moment. Emiko, the young mother, pressed her lips together before finally laughing, a small, broken laugh, born of disbelief. She fed herself slowly, her eyes shining with both gratitude and sorrow. Across the table, another woman bit into cherry pie and covered her mouth with her hands, as though trying to stop joy from escaping too loudly. The guards did not jeer, nor did they gloat. They served and then stepped back, watching quietly as the women ate. One soldier leaned against the wall, his rifle slung but his expression soft. Later he would confess in a letter home that he had never seen such fragile dignity in his life as he saw in that room, women eating as though food itself had become unbearable, a reminder of all that had been lost. He had not thought a slice of pie could carry such weight, yet he knew then that history's turning was not always marked by battles but by tables. For the women, the feast was more than nourishment. It was an assault on the deepest truths they had carried. The Empire had promised that the Americans were savages, brutes who would desecrate and destroy. Yet here they were, offering meals that could rival the New Year's banquets of their childhoods. Every bite felt like treason against the myths they had been raised with. And yet, every bite also felt like survival, like life itself. The contradiction carved them open, leaving wounds no blanket could hide. Keiko could not escape the sense that the meal was both mercy and judgment. As she chewed, she saw her father's stern face, her students' eager eyes, the Empire's banners fluttering in parades long past. All those images now warred with a steaming turkey on her plate, the golden crust of pie, the strange tenderness of enemies who were not supposed to be human. She wanted to hate them, but the food betrayed her. Hate and gratitude sat side by side inside her, tearing her apart. Later, in whispers that carried across the bunks, the women spoke of the feast as if it were a dream. Some said it proved American arrogance, that the enemy sought to humiliate by flaunting plenty in front of the conquered. Others claimed it revealed something dangerous, that the enemy was not arrogant but merciful, and that mercy was harder to resist than cruelty. Keiko said little, though her silence spoke louder than words. She could feel her old self slipping, piece by piece, undone not by torture but by kindness she could not explain. The statistics of war could never capture this moment. Reports would speak of prisoners fed adequately, of camps that met Geneva standards. But no document could explain the sight of women breaking into tears over mashed potatoes, or the way laughter, hesitant and fragile, crept back into the barracks as if it had been hiding all along. That night, the war became more complicated than rifles or bombs. It became a war of meanings, of symbols, of the unbearable truth that compassion could wound as deeply as cruelty. When the feast ended, the women leaned back, full in body but hollow in soul. The soldiers collected plates in silence, their boots echoing against the wooden floor. The lantern light dimmed, the food's aroma faded, but the memory of it burned into the women's minds. Keiko lay awake long after, her stomach heavy, her heart heavier still. She thought of her homeland across the sea, of families starving in the ashes of Tokyo, and of herself, a prisoner who had eaten more in one night than some had seen in months. The irony was unbearable. She was supposed to be the defeated, yet she had been fed like a guest. She was supposed to despise her captors, yet she could not erase the quiet dignity of their service. She was supposed to cling to her old certainties, yet those certainties cracked beneath the weight of pumpkin pie and warm biscuits. As she closed her eyes, one thought rose above the storm in her chest. The Americans had not conquered her with guns or chains. They had conquered her with food, with kindness, with a feast that reached deeper than propaganda ever could. And though she could not yet admit it, she knew the war within her would never be the same. For some battles are won not on the field, but at the table, and she had just witnessed one that would haunt her forever. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.